Esther chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimi, son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge over the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality or family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was doing and what was happening. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Have you ever been really hungry for something? Maybe it was a pizza. You're really hungry for one. You go out and you buy one. You eat it, and every bite was perfect grease and cheese and dough. But then there was a problem. A few hours later, you were hungry again. What you desired, what you wanted, didn't completely fill you. And this is something that we as humans are prone to, not just with food, but with many different things. This is why when you buy something new, it loses its luster after about 3 months, and it doesn't fill the holes within you. Marketers know this, and they take advantage of this. This is why when you buy a new phone, about 6 to 8 months later, it seems like maybe that there's another phone that's newer and better. And you realize year after year that you have to keep buying these new phones because the old ones have lost their luster. And again, this happens with food, this happens with personal items, this happens with everything in humanity, because deep within us, there is a longing in our hearts. And we've talked about this before, how you and I are created to be with God and to be in God's presence. But that longing deep within our hearts shows that we are not there. And we try to fill that longing with other things, with what scripture call, or what some theologians call lovers less wild. Things like pizza or phones or food or other people. We try to fill those things, our longing for God, with other things. And that's what's being put on display in today's text. This is a horrible, horrible text, a horrible story about what is happening. The king Xerxes, as we talked last week, had planned an invasion of Greece and had many different banquets. And he traveled to Greece, but his army was defeated, and he returns back home. And chapter 2 takes place after that invasion has failed. And Xerxes is upset. He, the one who wanted to conquer the world, is unable to conquer this small land of Greece. And so he begins to look around and realize that he has failed. And so he begins to feel that loneliness, that longing, that guilt, and he turns to remember Vashti, the queen he had banished. Should he let her return? And again, like last week in verse 2, we see that the advisors are speaking at length here, influencing the king. Now, for these advisors, they are the ones who are responsible for Vashti being sent away. So if she returns, they are the ones who are going to face her wrath. So they have to come up with another way to satisfy the king's desires without it involving Vashti. And so their plan is simple. They will herd together all the young women of the kingdom, the most beautiful young women of the kingdom. These girls are probably early teens, 13 to 15 years old. Gather them together for the king to fulfill his desires with. And we do know that there was a practice in the Persian world where each year 500 young boys would be gathered together to serve as eunuchs. And this is very similar, except it's for the women. This is not a beauty contest. Call it what it is. This is the mass rape of young girls by a man who has been humiliated and is seeking to fulfill his desires to conquer. And so the women come, but they spend a year getting beautified with cosmetics and learning and being covered in oils and lotion to make them more attractive. This whole story is about lust. It is the desire of a depressed king to fulfill those desires in his heart. And then suddenly in verse 5, the story is interrupted. This terrible situation is interrupted, and we meet a man by the name of Mordecai. Now, we're going to see Mordecai a number of times, but what's important to know is that Mordecai is a Jew who did not return home when the exile ended. He remained in Persia. And we are also told that he is very much connected to the story of Israel. His relative is Kish, and Kish is the name of Saul's father. So he is connected to Saul, the first king of Israel. So Mordecai becomes an important piece, and we'll come back to that Saul connection next week. But what we learn is that Mordecai has adopted his cousin whose Hebrew name is Hadassah, or whose Persian name is Esther. We know it better by her Persian name, Esther, but she has two different names, is living in the land. She is an orphan, she is young, and Mordecai has brought her in and is watching over her. And because of that, he is very much concerned about her. Because we read in verse 8 that she is desirous, that she is taken, and we read then in verse 9 that Hadassah is pleasing in the eyes of the king and all the people around. Now, these verbs are really important. If you know the story of Genesis 3, when God creates the universe, God makes all things good. God gives Adam and Eve the command to be caretakers and partner with God to expand his kingdom in the world. But they are brought before two different trees, one the tree of life that gives them life, and one the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God tells them they are not ready for yet. But the serpent comes and tricks Eve and then Adam. And the verbs that are used in that moment in Genesis 3 is that Eve sees the fruit, she desires it, sees that it's good, and she takes it for herself and gives it to Adam. These are the same verbs that are being used in this Esther story. In other words, the author wants us to see that Esther has become the fruit for the king. He desires her, and it's all he cares about. And the king, and understand that these women, when Esther goes to the king and these other young women go to the king, in verse 14, they are not going to clean his room. They're not going to make his bed. They are a faceless mass of lust. And the more the king takes, the more he wants. And the cycle is overwhelming and very disturbing. But in the end, it is Esther who is chosen as the one to be queen, the one who pleases the king the most. And we'll see in the next couple chapters just how much she actually does please the king. But for now, she chooses to keep her identity as a Jew a secret. And here's what this means for us. This is very important for us to understand, that we are a people who are filled with desires. We are a people who are filled with desires, and those desires aren't necessarily bad things. But when we use those desires to fill the place that is only set for God, bad things begin to happen. And so Esther, this chapter in Esther is showing us that the king, who we saw last week was filled with rage and anger, is now filled with desires. And he is filled with these desires that he is using to lead himself and damage so many other people that he is responsible for caring for in his kingdom. And the question, or the challenge for us this week is this: pay attention to what it is that you desire. Maybe keep a piece of paper with you, or at the end of the day, make a list of the things that you desire and ask yourself the question, do I want this? Why do I want this? And be honest with yourself. This is a difficult thing to do, but it's like if you're out walking down a stream, in the middle of a stream, and you flip over a rock to see what's underneath it, and you get to see the crayfish and the fish that are hiding underneath that rock. That's what this is about. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes determination. Then sit with your longings before God. This isn't about working harder. This is about God revealing to you your desire for him. He wants to be with you. He's already with you. It's about you and I taking the time to sit down and hear his voice. Psalm 42 says that as the deer pants for the water, so our hearts, so we long for God. And that's what this text is about. Just like Esther in the story has two names. She has one name that is a Jewish name and one name that is a Persian name. She has Hadassah, the Jewish name, and Esther, the Persian name. She is a person filled with two different paths. And so are we, as our desires pull us further and further away from what God has called us to. When we think that we need things more than we need God, when our lives are spent on with time focused on things that we desire that are not of God, then we have lost the path that God has put before us. So may the peace of Christ be with you, and may the Spirit fill your desires this week.